In this lesson, we will discuss filing status. After completing this lesson, you will be able to choose the most advantageous and allowable filing status for the taxpayer. If you will remember from the tax terminology section, there are 5 filing statuses: single, married filing jointly, married filing separately, head of household, and qualifying widow or widower with dependent child. Now I have married filing separately highlighted here. That's because it is the least advantageous filing status, and we will talk about why in a moment. Open the Publication 4012 to the Filing Status tab. We will be using the Determination of Filing Status Decision Tree chart, the Filing Status chart, and Who is a Qualifying Person qualifying you to file as Head of Household chart. The IRS requires that we use these 3 charts to determine filing status. A taxpayer may think that they already know what filing status they should use, but these questions will help you accurately determine the most advantageous and allowable filing status for the taxpayer. So it's very important that you always use these charts. So the first filing status is single. Now, a taxpayer is considered single if on the last day of the tax year, which would be December 31st, the taxpayer was not married, or legally separated or divorced, or widowed. However, it is important to note that some taxpayers who have a marital status of single may also be eligible to file under a more advantageous status, such as head of household or qualifying widow or widower with dependent child. So be sure to check all of the filing status options, and you will be able to avoid choosing the wrong filing status by using the Publication 4012. The next filing status is married filing jointly. So if on the last day of the tax year, if a taxpayer lived together as a married couple, or they lived apart but they were not legally separated or divorced, or one spouse died during the tax year and the taxpayer did not remarry, then the taxpayer can file as married filing jointly. Married taxpayers can also choose to file separately. However, if a married couple files separately and one spouse itemizes, then the other spouse must also itemize. Okay? Now, taxpayers filing with this status are not eligible to claim several incredibly beneficial tax credits, including the Earned Income Credit, the American Opportunity Credit, just to name a few. Now, be careful because this status is generally going to result in a higher overall tax. For a couple of different reasons. The standard deduction is going to be lower for married filing separately. As I just mentioned, taxpayers won't be eligible for credits, so they won't get as much of a refund to offset some of the tax they may owe. Also, if a spouse itemizes and the other spouse doesn't have anything to itemize their deductions with, then they may end up with a deduction of 0, which can also hurt them quite a bit. So why do some choose married filing separately? Well, sometimes married filing separately is chosen when one spouse does not want to be responsible for the other spouse's tax obligations, or if filing separately may result in a lower total tax. Now, that last situation is pretty rare. That does not happen very often when filing separately results in a lower total tax, at least for the taxpayers that we will see at our sites. All right. However, we will have some that want to avoid an offset of their refund against their spouse's outstanding debts. So those can include things like child support, past due student loan interest or student loan debts. So a taxpayer may decide that they want to file separately because they don't want to lose their refund. Even in these circumstances, there may be a more advantageous way for the taxpayer to file. That would be with an injured spouse form. And we'll talk more about an injured spouse form in a later training. But an injured spouse form is a form that can be filed with a joint return, but relieve the, quote, injured spouse of the debts from the other spouse, allowing them to keep their portion of the refund. Okay? So even if you have a taxpayer that wants to file separately to avoid being responsible for their other spouse's debts, we will try to encourage those taxpayers to file married filing jointly still and file this injured spouse form. All right, one quick note If a spouse died during the tax year and the taxpayer did not remarry, they're going to be considered married for the entire tax year. Okay, so the surviving spouse will then be eligible to file married filing jointly if they so choose, or if they want to file separately from their spouse for some reason, they can also choose to do that. Surviving spouses that remarry must file jointly or separately with their new spouse. Okay, then the deceased spouse's filing status then becomes married filing separately. All right, let's move on to head of household. This is the most complicated filing status to determine and will require you to use multiple charts in the publication 4012 to help you determine it, yet it is one of the most common at the Save First tax sites. So there are two scenarios in which a taxpayer can file head of household. The first scenario concerns a married taxpayer who is separated from his or her spouse. So to file head of household and be married, a taxpayer must be considered unmarried. Okay, so we'll talk about what that means in just a minute. The taxpayer must file a separate return from their spouse. The taxpayer must maintain more than half the cost of keeping up a home. And the home must be the main home for a dependent child. So that would be a dependent child, stepchild, or foster child. Only one of those three: child, stepchild, or foster child, for more than half the year. So note here that a grandchild does not meet this test. All right. So even though a grandchild can be a qualifying child for the dependency exemption, they are not a qualifying person in this scenario for head of household. Finally, the taxpayer must claim the exemption for the dependent child. So what do I mean when I say considered unmarried? For a married taxpayer to be considered unmarried for the purposes of head of household, he or she must not have lived with their spouse at any time during the last 6 months of the tax year. So this means that if a taxpayer moved out of the home from their spouse on August 1st of the tax year, they cannot be considered unmarried for the purposes of head of household. The second scenario concerns a single taxpayer with a qualifying person for head of household. Okay. So to be single and qualify for head of household, you must maintain more than half the cost of keeping up a home, and a qualifying person must live with the taxpayer for more than half the year. So let's talk about what a qualifying person means. First of all, go ahead and flip to the chart that says who is a qualifying person, qualifying you to file as head of household in the filing status tab of the Pub 4012. You are always going to need to consult this page when determining if a single taxpayer has a qualifying person for head of household. So if you'll go ahead and flip over there now, we will briefly review the rules that are on this page. So in general, a qualifying child, as determined in the exemptions chart, is a qualifying person for head of household, whether or not the taxpayer claims the exemption or not. If you will remember from the exemptions lesson, sometimes parents will sign a division of benefits form, which allows the custodial parent to file as head of household without actually claiming the exemption for the child. Okay, so that's what that note there is referring to. In general, a qualifying relative, as determined in the exemptions chart, is a qualifying person if the taxpayer can claim the exemption for the person meets one of the relationships listed. So if you'll look on that chart, you'll see a number of relationships such as son, daughter, sister, brother, half-sister, father-in-law, daughter-in-law, etc. You'll notice that these are the same relationships as defined in the relationship test in the qualifying relatives exemptions chart. Okay. And finally, the person must live with the taxpayer for more than half the year. Now, there is one exception to this last rule. A mother or father who is a qualifying relative does not have to live in the home with the taxpayer to be considered a qualifying person. But the taxpayer does have to pay half the cost to keep up the parent's home in order for them to qualify. So if you'll remember from our determination of a qualifying relative, sometimes there are dependents that do not have to be related to you in one of those ways listed in the relationship test. They just had to live with you for all 12 months of the year. So that could be a friend or a cousin or really any other person that you supported. that person is not going to be considered a qualifying person for head of household. All right? It's very important that they meet one of those relationships listed and they live with them for more than half the year in order to be considered a qualifying person for head of household. So determining if a taxpayer can qualify for head of household can get complicated, which is why it's extremely important to use these charts in the publication 4012. So if you're not quite sure that you understand how to determine head of household, I recommend that you go ahead and rewind and rewatch this section again. This will be one of the most important pieces of tax knowledge for you to know this year. All right, so once again, let's just review what happens with this division of benefits form. If the custodial parent has given up his or her right to claim the dependency exemption for a child by signing that division of benefits form, the child can still be his or her qualifying child for head of household. Okay, so the non-custodial parent can never claim head of household unless he or she has some other qualifying person living in their household that does qualify them. Okay. So when a parent signs this Form 8332, the non-custodial parent gets the dependency exemption and the child tax credit, and the custodial parent gets the head of household filing status, as well as the child and dependent care credit and the earned income credit. Our final filing status is going to be qualifying widow or widower with dependent child. This filing status is perhaps the most exclusive filing status. We won't see a lot of taxpayers at our sites that will qualify for this. So a taxpayer can file this way if his or her spouse died recently and the taxpayer did not remarry in the tax year, and the taxpayer has a dependent child. Okay, so that only includes son, daughter, stepson, or stepdaughter. Doesn't include any other relationships. And finally, the taxpayer provides over half the cost to maintain the home for himself and the child. So how do we determine how an unmarried widowed taxpayer should file? Okay, so let's just follow these rules. If the spouse died during the current tax year, they will file married filing jointly with their deceased spouse. Okay. If the spouse died during one of the 2 preceding tax years, and the taxpayer has one of those qualifying dependent childs that we mentioned on the previous slide, so son, daughter, stepson, or stepdaughter, they can file as qualifying widow or widower. And if the spouse died 3 or more years before the current tax year, they will either file as single or head of household if they still have a qualifying person in their house. So you'll see that's why we very rarely will have anyone that will file as qualifying widow or widower, but it does happen occasionally, so you still need to know how to determine it. This slide shows the filing statuses from lowest to highest tax burden. Okay, so i.e. that means from the lowest taxes owed to the highest taxes owed. You're going to want to give the taxpayer the best filing status that he or she qualifies for. So the best filing status is going to be either married filing jointly or qualifying widow or widower. The reason that that one's the best one is they have the highest standard deduction amount, which we'll talk about in a later training. Next will be head of household, followed by single, and then last we have married filing separately. Now remember that we want to strongly discourage taxpayers from filing separately if at all possible. So you're going to need to discuss the taxpayer's concerns with them and present any possible alternatives to filing separately. So at this point, we're going to take a look at a couple of video examples illustrating each of these filing statuses so that we can kind of learn how to use these charts appropriately to help us determine filing status.
Okay, so we are going to go through this chart to determine your filing status. So were you married on the last day of the year?
No, I wasn't.
Okay. Did your spouse die during the year?
No, I didn't have
any. Okay, did you have any dependents, any children?
I don't think I did.
No, okay.
No, I don't.
Okay, great, so no, that means you will file as single this year.
Excellent.
Alright, so we're just going to determine your filing status. So I'm assuming we have to ask, were y'all 2 married on the last day of the year?
When did we get married again?
I never remember.
I don't know. We did.
Okay, great. Well, as long as you were married on the last day of the year, that's all that matters. And are you 2 wanting to file together? It's typically more beneficial. I guess so. I've never done it that way before, obviously. Okay, well, we'll put you as married filing jointly then. I think that makes the most sense.
All right, so let's go ahead and determine your filing status. So were you married on the last day of the year?
No, I was not married, unfortunately.
Okay, have you ever been married before?
I don't believe so.
No, so no. Okay, and we did determine that you'll be claiming your grandson as a dependent. So we just need to see if he qualifies you for head of household.
Excellent.
So basically, is your grandson single?
He is.
He is. Okay, so then he will be a qualifying person. And did you pay more than half of the cost of keeping up your home for him?
I pay all the costs.
Okay, great. So
It's a very
you
expensive
will.
home.
Oh, I'm sorry about that. All right, you're head of household in
Thank you.
Mountain Brook.
Awesome. Thank you. Hey, how are you doing?
Good, how are you?
I'm doing well. I'm doing the best I can, man. It's just a struggle out there.
Yeah, especially this time of year.
Yeah.
Make a break time. You ready?
I'm ready, man.
All right. So, were you married on the last day of the year?
No, I wasn't married last year.
Okay. Did your spouse die during the year? Well,
She old, man.
did she pass in 2013? 14, I'm sorry, this is
She was gone in March of 2013, man.
2013.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Me and my son, I'm trying to be strong for him, man.
Okay, so were you remarried? Have you
No,
married?
man, I ain't getting married, man.
Okay.
I ain't getting married.
Okay. And your son lives with you, and you keep up more than half the cost of keeping up your home for you, correct?
Man, I pay everything to keep up that home, man. It's hard, man. It's hard.
Okay, and your son lived with you all year?
Yeah, he lived with me all year.
Okay.
I moved him out his room because he hit his mama walking in the hallways at night, man. It's hard, man.
Okay, so let's go ahead and determine your filing status. Were you married on the last day of last year?
Yes, we were.
Okay. And did you live apart for the last 6 months of the year?
Oh my, yes. It was just my son and me.
Oh, okay. All right. So, did you pay more than half of the cost of keeping up your home for your son?
Listen, I paid all of it.
Oh, okay.
I sure did.
Great. Well, more power to you.
Thank you.
Yeah. And you do claim an exemption for your son. So, did he live with you for more than half of the year?
Well, he started college and lives in the dorm at school, but he stays with me the rest of the time.
Okay, well, since you'll be claiming him as a dependent, even though he lived away technically, that's just considered a temporary absence.
Even if it's in Auburn?
Yes,
Okay.
even still. So you will be head of household since he is your dependent.
Awesome. Thank you so much. God bless you, ma'am.
Oh, thank you.
Of course.
So that concludes the lesson on filing status. Now that you've completed this lesson, you should be able to choose the most advantageous and allowable filing status for a taxpayer.